why do some people, really choose to go on holiday to places that are dark sites where lots and lots of people have been murdered or killed? The classic dark site is, and the classic notion of dark tourism is one that thinks about and casts the dark site as the site of slaughter or violence or murder or in some cases genocide. And people go to them and probably go to them for a lot of different reasons.
And we'll explore those different reasons on today's show with our guest, James Treadwell, who is a professor of criminology at Staffordshire University and the co-author of 50 Dark Destinations, Crime and Contemporary Tourism, some of which may surprise you. For example, Disney World, the Maldives, dark destinations? You'll find out what it's all about in this episode. Welcome to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend.
You're listening to the Zero to Travel podcast, where we explore exciting travel-based work, lifestyle, and business opportunities, helping you to achieve your wildest travel dreams. And now your host, world wanderer and travel junkie, Jason Moore.
Hey there, it's Jason with ZeroToTravel.com. Welcome to the show, my friend. Thanks for hanging out, letting me bring a little travel into your ears today. This is the show to help you travel the world on your terms, to fill your life with as much travel as you desire, no matter what your situation or experience. At the time of publication, it is Halloween, so I thought, what better way to ring it in than to do an episode on dark tourism. And we have a much deeper conversation, not just around the destinations themselves, but what really makes a destination dark. Why are we as humans attracted to them? Are we all just deviant tourists, which is a term I had not heard until this conversation and this book. And so a lot to unpack here today. Hope you enjoy going deep on dark tourism. And I promise we'll crawl out into the light by the end of the interview. Don't you worry. Enjoy the show, and I'll see you on the other side, my friend. I'm happy we're here. We got you here. And I should say welcome to you, Professor James Treadwell. Welcome to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend. Thanks for being here.
Thank you ever so much for having me on, Jason. I'm really pleased to be here.
Whereabouts in England are you?
I'm in right in the centre of England. I live in Birmingham, England's fantastic second city. Although we compete with Manchester very often, people think Manchester's the second city, but it's Birmingham, birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, the giver of my wonderful accent, which I try and not to affect too much because your listeners may know Brummers. We tend to talk like that, and after the success of the popular television programme Peaky Blinders, everybody knows Brummers now. But I try and make sure I don't do the Brummie accent too much.
I sadly still cannot recognize the various accents in England and the various regions. So, I mean, you guys have a whole different take on it. I mean, you could have said anywhere in England, and I would have been like, cool.
Absolutely. And it's the same for people in the UK when they come to the US. I'm sure we cause all sorts of inadvertent and unintended defence by not being able to pick it up. But similarly, we in the UK, as you travel around the UK, there are parts of the UK where I can barely comprehend what people are saying to me. One of my co-authors on the book, Craig Kelly, is from Leeds, and there are times where I struggle to understand him. It's part of the kind of rich tapestry of geography, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to talk about the book, 50 Dark Destinations, Crime and Contemporary Tourism today, but I wanted to ask you, I've never spoken with a criminologist before. You're a professor of criminology. This is, I guess, the study of crime in the criminal mind. Why did you get into criminology? Like, how did that kind of evolve for you? Where's the interest?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. My background was working in prisons and prison settings and prison systems, which, in some ways it explains the kind of link and the connection in the book, because as I'm sure your listeners will know, places like Alcatraz, for example, once former prison sites, then kind of get shut down, closed down, and then turned into tourist attractions, which is, I suppose, how the connection comes through there. But yeah, my background was working in and talking to prisoners and offenders, people involved in crime and criminality, and those sorts of aspects of kind of understanding why crimes happen, how they happen, and how society reacts to them is more usually the stuff of criminology. But criminology is this kind of wide-ranging, broad subject now that encompasses so many different things. And one aspect, I think, of trying to make criminology more accessible to the general public and to people more generally is to think about how crime might touch on their lives and how it might kind of come into their kind of experiences, which fortunately, frequently, for the most part, isn't through the experience of actual crime. A lot of our perceptions about crime and criminality, thankfully, don't come from being victims of crime or having them happen to us. It was initially through sort of criminology that, as well, that I've been really lucky to travel all over the world. And I suppose the book that we're talking about sort of starts with that point. I've been fantastically lucky in that I've been to the United States of America, and on the occasions I've been to the US, I've been into places where I've been into prison sites. So Jessup Correctional, for example, in the United States, and through going into prisons there, and not long before the COVID pandemic struck and locked us all in our houses. I was in Australia and New Zealand going into prisons, and then I kind of flew back into the UK, just having got back thinking, I'd really like to travel more and to see more of the world. COVID struck, it locked us all in our houses, and we suddenly sort of started, with my co-authors, we started to talk about travel, and that really was the sort of origin of us writing a book that's about crime and contemporary travel, and trying to use contemporary travel and go into places really as a way of having bigger and broader debates about crime, travel, the ethics of harm, and what the world is like, really.
Do you remember where you began to have an interest in working with prisons? Do you remember the first time, for example, that you walked into a prison?
Yeah, I absolutely remember the first time that I walked into a prison. It was my local prison, HMP Birmingham, which is this austere Victorian building. And I think again, this is the thing with travel. The first time you go into a prison, particularly in the UK, where they do tend to be this sort of austere Victorian buildings, very often built in the centre of cities. HMP Birmingham would be like HMP Manchester or Strangeways prison, which was the site of the sort of famous riot in the UK. They're very old kind of buildings, but because they're very old buildings, are very kind of ornate and structured. You'd see the same with sort of wormwood scrubs. They tend to retain a sort of smell. The hearing, the noise travels around them in strange and odd ways, the slamming of doors. When you first go into them, they're quite disorientating. It's like going to a very new place, because for most of us, we haven't set foot into those sorts of places. And I suppose there's a kind of an analogy there that it's a bit like being a tourist. It's what a tourist does when you go into and you visit somewhere that you're unfamiliar with. The unfamiliar heightens the senses. The sounds, the smells are important. The feel of the place. And really, then quickly those sorts of things fade into the background and we don't think about them. But also, we make sense of that unfamiliar by what's familiar to us and what we understand. The joy of going on holiday is very often when we return home at the end of it, isn't it? And we go back to everything that we know and what we've loved our 2 weeks away. We come back and, I don't know what it would be like in the States, but maybe, I just want to be able to get those genuine, Twinkie bars that I can't get elsewhere. elsewhere, or a real can of, my favourite root beer or whatever that I've missed. It's that kind of joy of returning to your own place and that understanding of it that frames your understanding of difference as well. But I suppose what I'm doing here is what academics really, I think, are supposed to do is we're supposed to think about things and talk about things and try and get others to think about them. And it was kind of through going into prisons, and initially it was as a criminologist. I started off sort of, thinking about, and I think most of us, my colleague and co-author Adam Lyons would say the same thing. We tend to think about, well, what is it that makes people do these bad and dark things? Why do people murder? Why do they kill? And then more broadly, we've started to ask questions, I think, about, well, why is it that people are attracted to those who murder and kill? When I was talking about the COVID pandemic, the sort of things that people became very interested in at the time. I don't know if you remember, the documentaries that are going on Netflix at the time are things like Tiger King, which is this sort of tale of true crime in a way, and it attracts everyone and it becomes a talking point. But why are we attracted to those sorts of stories? Why is it that, crime media pulls people in? Why do some people, collect serial killer art, or is that a bit strange or weird or different, or is there a propensity in lots of us to do that? And then a question, that sort of framed the book in the outset was, why do some people, really choose to go on holiday to places that are dark sites where lots and lots of people have been murdered or killed? The classic dark site is, and the classic notion of dark tourism is one that thinks about and casts the dark site as, the site of slaughter or violence or murder or in some cases genocide. And people go to them and probably go to them for a lot of different reasons. Now, again, the book really is about, we started off, I think, thinking about dark tourism in that very conventional way, in the way that it had been defined by other academics. But I think as people, if they read the book and they look at it, what we then start to do is we start to say, but is that what dark tourism really is? Or is there more to it than that? Why is it that some sites are remembered or thought of or associated with dark tourism, but others aren't? Why is it that some places, are considered, and why is it that some people going to some places are considered to be obsessed by the macabre or the taboo, and yet other places, different places may have some of that in their history, but we don't think about that as dark tourism. So we started to ask some questions about, well, what is this term dark? What does dark tourism even mean? And I think what the book becomes is it becomes more a discussion about the harms that can be there, seen or unseen, that are inherent in all forms of tourism in a way.
There are really two theoretical frameworks that underpin the book, which is Gray's theory and deviant leisure. And I was wondering if you could summarize this, because I think you mentioned when we were getting into this before we even started chatting, we're like, although on the surface it seems like, oh, this is going to be like a travel book, like 50 Dark Destinations. It's more of an academic book, I would say, with a lot of discussion points and things to debate coming out of each section. But I think it's important, and just for all of us to understand and give context to this conversation, these two theoretical frameworks that underpin the book, this Gray's theory and deviant leisure. And if you could explain it like in layman's terms, because I'm trying to get it from the book and I'm just like, it's just still a little foggy to me.
Yeah,
so,
no, absolutely. And one of the things that we want to do is
I don't speak
really
academic, Professor.
Yeah, no, and academics are terrible, because even when we try, and we have tried not to speak academic, we do kind of fall back into it. I think what I would say in the first instance is one of the things I try and do, and desperately try and do as an academic, is try and make it academia for everyone. Because, a lot of the time we do sit in our ivory towers and we pontificate and we use these kind of theoretical terms, and they just drive people away. Gray's theory, but essentially, when I was talking about those questions about what is it that attracts people to the lurid, the macabre, the dark, the criminal, it's about kind of reappraising that and rethinking people's own kind of complicity in some ways in consuming crime. Because, like I said with the Netflix example, we're all in some ways kind of consumers of crime, but we all sort of position it problematically in other places. So the most sort of sensationalist forms of kind of consumption of crime are regarded as the sort of problematic ones, while we kind of don't regard ourselves as doing this. And what Gray's theory particularly does is it looks at the sort of very sensational aspects of of crime as a commodity that's sold to people, and where kind of populist accounts come to be kind of very often sort of framed as the norm. So, as a criminologist more broadly, operating in the United Kingdom, we devote, and our media devote a huge amount of attention to, for example, murders, homicides, rapes. But actually, the more likelihood of people being victimed in victims in everyday life is much more kind of mundane than the sensationalist. But we don't think about things like, when we're ripped off on eBay, or
when the cryptocurrency market collapses.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. We don't think of those things. Yeah, we don't think of those things as crime. Deviant leisure similarly thinks about what it is that's harmful or bad in sort of in leisure practices, and we know that sort of some leisure practices are very tied to. In some cases, some leisure practices are out and out criminal in and of themselves. So kind of going out urban exploring and breaking into places and trespassing might be criminalised, or there might be sort of forms of leisure. I'm sure we'll talk in time about the dark destinations that are in the book. But British tourists, for example, in the past were infamous when they went away with football, for example, for exporting football hooliganism across the globe and so on. But then at the same time, one of the things that kind of deviant leisure is doing is it's kind of it's trying to regard that as on a kind of continuum where everybody in some ways is complicit in some of those sorts of harmful practices, but very often we don't necessarily recognize our own contribution to harmful practices or whose expense it happens at. So it's kind of, again, I think both perspectives, really what they're trying to do is they're trying to kind of reintroduce a degree of kind of nuance and complexity into a world that often sees things as very black and white. Crime is good and bad, and it's them and us. And we often don't kind of stop and consider how much more complex it is in the real world. And both of those perspectives, essentially, on a bigger level, are about kind of thinking about how often it isn't black and white, and how actually far more people are involved and implicated than necessarily recognise it. And in a way, that's what the book is trying to do, because, and I think this is the core in trying to explain the book in some ways. If you look at most stuff on dark tourism, it starts off by kind of repeating the same destinations over and over again. And we're not saying that those aren't dark tourist sites, Auschwitz or the killing fields of Cambodia. But what the book moves to do, I think, is it looks at places, it begins to ask questions and looks at places that traditionally people wouldn't think of as being about dark tourism at all. Going to the Maldives for your honeymoon, the Atoll Islands, or going on a skiing holiday. People don't think of those things as in any way, shape or form dark tourism with any kind of connection to crime at all. But what we're saying is, perhaps if we think again, we can see that those things might be built on harmful practices, that they might be built on forms of exploitation and harming other people that might not be overtly obvious in the first instance. But there's more to see here than it being black and white.
So we're all criminals. is what you're saying.
Well, I mean, the danger here as well is, and I was, we were doing a book launch on this the other day, and I had to say, what I'm not trying to do is trying to be this, because nothing annoys anybody more than that kind of moralizing tone when someone comes in and goes, it's all your fault, which interestingly I think is very much a part of the world at the moment, and that often divides up into black and white views that I'm very much against as well. But if we think, for example, about the harms that are done, and Craig, my co-author, tells this wonderful story where he sort of said, as soon as lockdown was done, one of the first things he did was he took his kids to the Royal Armouries in Leeds. Now, these basically show all the kind of guns and weapons and the evolution of firearms. And, and he sort of said, but the thing is, if I'd gone to a museum of death, that would be kind of considered, you're going and getting yourself involved in murderabilia and so on. But no, if you go into a museum that's full of kind of arms and swords and then firearms and so on, and this is history, we're not thinking about how that's been, necessarily what the Royal Armouries do is they deal with the business of death and the export of killing around the globe, and the history of the British Empire and its kind of violent expansion into other sites. Now, we're not trying to do that in a way that kind of says, that sets this sort of moralizing tone in a way, because similarly, that sort of exploitation that underpins the history of the British Empire hasn't gone away. So, for example, one of the sites in the book that we mentioned as a dark destination, Qatar, where they hosted the World Cup, where Qatar is trying to kind of re-establish its relationship with, being good and ethical for tourism. Well, Qatar as a country ended its collaboration with the Union Federations on improving labour rights 2 days after the World Cup final, it's being said today, and what Qatar did to build its World Cup stadiums is it exported in vast amounts of impoverished, almost sort of slave labour from other countries, so that kind of Western consumers of football could go and be involved in this celebration of football. And hey, isn't it brilliant? And look, what a great event and how good it is for all of us. And we forget the fact that, that slavery hasn't really gone away, because there are workers dying, poor workers exported from Bangladesh dying on the construction sites, and that's kind of cleansed from our view, and it's very much done for the benefits of Western consumers. And it doesn't sort of suggest that slavery is over. Slavery is far from over, but we often don't think about that when we consume. We kind of think, this is said and done. The world is a far better place now, and and we think of slavery as being something that's past when it comes to, for example, going to tourist sites, and they educate us on the harms that were inherent in history, and it's kind of done and good, and that's it. Whereas in reality, these things are still there today.
So the World Cup example, I guess if we were going to slot something under the theoretical framework of deviant leisure, you could say that a World Cup viewer would be participating in deviant leisure. Let's say that would illustrate that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Or could be said to, because of course, like I say, it's contested, and the realm is contested. So in the UK, Qatar's hosting of the World Cup kind of created a fierce division. And I don't know if your listeners in America would know about this one, but, David Beckham, who's probably our most kind of prominent footballer ever, celebrity figure around the globe, took money from Qatar to go out and be part of the kind of image branding of it. And then a comedian who actually lives around the corner from me, he's quite a famous comedian in the UK, he might not have broken the US yet, called Joe Lycett, who's gay, made a very big protest protest about the fact that Beckham had engaged with Qatar. His protest involved him saying that he was going to shred £10,000 of his own money if Beckham didn't pull out. Ultimately, then he got some pressure for saying that. He kind of fictionally shredded the money. But then, interestingly, it came out that Lycett himself had travelled to Qatar to put on comedy gigs. So he was kind of criticising Beckham for doing what he himself had done. And I think that's a useful analogy for us, because that's where deviant leisure and Gray's theory help us out, because traditionally dark tourism has been thought of as something that those strange people do. It's a kind of niche activity that obsessive kind of people who want to consume the history of wars or violence go off and do, and they do it out there, and it's not the likes of us. But actually, what deviant leisure is kind of encouraging us to do is to think of our own part in that system, and in a way that perhaps Lycett wasn't. It's easy to kind of identify the harms that other people are doing, but we don't necessarily always reflect on how we're connected to the harms. So, climate change, kind of becomes, well, those people who get on flights and do harms, but we get on flights and do that. Now, don't get me wrong, at the same time, I do totally get why people get very fed up, for example, by lots of multimillionaires who take far more flights than the rest of us, kind of going to Davos and telling us all about the harms that are done. But I think that similarly can sometimes come from a similar place where we consider, we kind of consider other people the kind of harbingers or consumers of bad practice and not ourselves. And what the book's trying to do is to say, just, hey, wait a minute, guys, there might be something more to this than dark tourism being something that those people over there who go to murder sites or genocide things do. It might be much more tied to tourism everywhere than we've considered before.
Just to kind of reflect back, the intention behind the book is to kind of spark conversation, but you mentioned the sort of the black and white, and there's a lot of gray area, yet I would argue perhaps that lumping everything under one term, dark tourism, is actually erasing the gray area and putting a label on everything. But I would like to hear your argument back.
No, I absolutely. I can see that kind of argument, and there is that problem in that, then how do we begin to understand that some may form up in the kind of more extreme forms of kind of consumption of what are the conventional dark sites. But then that's where what are the conventional dark sites, I think, was for us the problem, because some places badge themselves for various different reasons as more kind of overtly connected with harm or crime. You can't deny harms or crime if you're talking about Auschwitz or the Jack the Ripper tour or the Cray tour in London, or even if we're thinking about, for example, the backdrop context of the killing fields of Cambodia and so on. But are people who go to the 9/11 memorial dark tourists? And I can see your argument for coming back and saying, well, if you begin to erase that label, do you, and you put everything together, do you create problems? But perhaps it is more located in the individual, because some people, for example, who go to these sites like the 9/11 memorial, some people will go to them in a very somber way to kind of pay respect, very thoughtful and considered about how they're behaving. Some others will kind of take parts of them as a kind of another part of the holiday with selfies and beers on the way, and where, hey, and I think, again, this is where it kind of is complex. You when you think about, for example, Auschwitz, which is on the edges of kind of Krakow in Poland. Krakow is the kind of ultimate stag and hen destination for lots of people in the UK. So they go there to kind of go heavy drinking and have lots of fun. And then similarly, as part of that, visit Auschwitz, and you get kind of tours of school children and stag do's. And some of them perhaps don't give the kind of somber reflection that you'd expect at those sorts of sites and settings. And should we reserve a kind of a label for the concerning practices? Perhaps you're right. Perhaps we should. But I think as we kind of go through the book and we think a bit more about what these sites are, we are asking some useful and kind of relevant questions about tourism and travel in the world today. So why is it, for example, that, you can go on a virtual or in-person tour of the Amazon warehouse in Rugeley, where Amazon want to show you, their staff members smiling and waving at the cameras and, telling you how wonderful the workplace is. And
now that sounds dark.
Well, this is the point, Jason. This is the point. Is that is pretty dark because when I watch guys get out of the Amazon van in like at the end of the shift or whatever, they're not. They don't necessarily look like they're smiling or they're happy. But similarly, if we think about some of the kind of labour practices, for example, that underpin the company with the mouse in located in Florida.
Yeah, Disney World is on your list. I wanted to bring that up. That was surprising to see. Like I get this PDF of the book and I see Disney World. I'm like, what is going on here?
Well, and this is where Grays and I think kind of Deviant Leisure are encouraging us to think a little bit more about how we consume essentially when we travel, and how we ask questions and how we go beneath the kind of surface of everything's great and wonderful here. Because if we think about all sorts of tourist destinations and places around the world, essentially, those who are making money out of kind of telling us, that this is an idyllic setting, are very often, doing perhaps huge amounts of harm to the people around them. Now, I recognise that there's another side of that argument, and that some would say, that tourism brings in vital money and it aids kind of development and it creates job opportunities and employment and offers people a hand out of poverty and so on. But I'm sure your listeners will have done it as well, where, you kind of, I'm really lucky. I've travelled extensively, so I can't criticise anyone for travelling. And I've fallen into the traps as well of going to places and kind of thinking, oh, isn't it wonderful? The kids were so welcoming to us and they ran up to meet us and, isn't it great? And everyone was really friendly. And this guy showed us round his like kind of house setting and I've been in the Bedouin camp in the desert or whatever. And isn't it great that they've been... And then you kind of go away thinking, I've had this wonderful experience and this was fantastic. But you don't really know what's going on for the people that are being kind of engaged to deliver that to you. They might seem like really, really friendly, but are they kind of struggling under exploitative labour practices where they can't really say no? Are they actually kind of being forced not to kind of form collectives or unions so that they can get a better deal? Are they really happy about the fact that, the local marina where the fishing boats used to go from has now been turned into a playground for the super rich and fabulously wealthy, while they've been kind of forced from their traditional home into some new site or setting? And do we know whether that's going on or not? Because it wouldn't be a very good kind of holiday or travel experience if that was put right in our line of sight. But I suppose what we're kind of asking in a way is, is there an ethic to consider those things and find them out? Should we kind of look again and not necessarily just take the surface level appearance of what's there and actually ask some sort of more probing questions about what's going on? And I think that's what we're trying to do in the book, so that some of those sort of places that you wouldn't necessarily consider, as kind of sites of exploitation or harm, that there might actually be a lot that's going on there, a lot of exploitation that's going on there, hidden beneath the surface. But you have to look, and do we look? Are we comfortable with doing that?
Well, I think a site like, including Disney World in the book, for example, to bring up some of those points you just mentioned and kind of spark the conversation. I guess as far as the book goes and some of the destinations you have listed, I can see that much more than I can see sort of the arguments you guys constructed around visiting the like Auschwitz, for example, or the 9/11 memorial, or like a former slave plantation, which of course the presentation, the experience, all of that plays into what quantifies a destination to be dark or just, historically important and also educationally important. My thought is that, I remember being a backpacker and being in Germany and wanting to visit Dachau because I had taken classes in college about the rise of Nazism and wanting to understand and I think there's something powerful and moving about being in a physical space where something horrific happened. And I think it is an essential role to play to have these places preserved and presented educationally, especially in the internet age where you have conspiracy theorists and doubters people say like this didn't happen. And it's like, well, no, this really happened. Like, actually you can go and see where this happened and feel, and you could never walk in their shoes, but how does that not increase sort of the empathy and the connection to a past historical event? And, your conclusion on that, I'll read a snippet of it. There's a full paragraph here so you can kind of respond, but it said the Holocaust tourism sites as dark sites of death are also sites of consumerism and leisure, acting as spatial crypts haunted by the ghosts of past violence. Death, specifically the death of the other, has been commodified, packaged up, and sold back to us as entertainment, leisure, and tourism under the guise of educational and historical preservation, where the tourist may have a vital role to play as a tertiary witness. Again, this is just me. I don't feel it's under the guise of educational and historical preservation. I feel that is the full intention behind these sites. I'm just speaking to one site that I've been to specifically, but going to like the Holocaust Museum in DC or something like that and seeing a big pile of shoes from people that were part of this genocide. I mean, it just brings it all to life. How does that not help people, say, hey, look, this happened. Let's make sure this never happens again. Let's keep this history alive.
Oh, sure, and it's just, and that is but one site as well, because like I've been to Srebrenica, where there's a far more recent genocide of Muslim men in the Yugoslavia war, where you can still meet the mothers of the missing outside. They still hold vigil, So we're not necessarily saying that these sites are not educational or are not valued, or there's not a value in doing that. I think it's questionable that everybody necessarily who turns up at those sites goes from that sort of motive of wanting to be educated in that preventative way. There was the other day we did a book launch, and the person who was with us to launch our book, a journalist in the UK, a friend of mine, Donald McIntyre, he made a film about a group of football hooligans in the UK. Those football hooligans visited Auschwitz not to commemorate or take seriously the site, but to mock it. And it's a really, really horrific thing to see, But bear in mind that although the intention can be there to educate, how that is used by others is beyond the control even of the best intended custodians and guardians. And I totally agree with you in that there are sites out there that are sort of there as sort of historical preservation and are really important educationally and should make us sort of think. I'm not necessarily sure that that's always the reaction from people as well. And the way that the problem with consumerism is once something is there to be consumed, the way people consume it can vary and change and alter, as it were. But similarly, with that kind of dark tourism, I'm not necessarily sure that the value is always in what you were describing. It's not always about pulling people in for that kind of teaching them the historical legacy of the killing fields or Auschwitz, or it can also be that the very sort of sensationalist and extreme can become badged up as a sort of site of consumption. So one of the places that I went to not long before we did the book when we were down in St. Louis and Louisiana. Adam and I went to a museum of kind of murder, and this was very much kind of badged up in a way that was kind of, it wasn't about, remembering the victims at all. The victims kind of became meaningless. It became the most kind of extreme sort of, we are going to shock you with real images of death and destruction and so on. And similarly, the Holocaust and kind of crimes against humanity featured there. And I again, I didn't necessarily get the feeling that the full intention was as a kind of educational vehicle. And I think that's the complexity, when it comes to the traditional kind of understanding of dark tourism is kind of very limited in a way. It's very thought out of as this kind of, it's narrowly, these are the sites. But even there's a kind of consumerist imperative where people are, for example, one of our competitor books, rates them with darkness ratings. Is this one 5 stars or 4 stars or 3 stars? What makes something more or less dark? And there is always that kind of element of kind of pulling people in. But on what you were saying about that kind of the importance of going and thinking and considering, I think that's something that we'd always want to kind of be promoting and thinking about, because what we're saying in those sites that aren't necessarily considered dark, but also might be, if we are thinking about the stadia that have been built in Qatar, think about the harms that are still done, that are still kind of going on, and think about what's shown and what's not shown and what the motives for it are, more than just kind of accepting what people are telling you as the motives for it. Amazon might not, Amazon might not be telling you the full truth on their warehouse tours, while prison tours, for example, you can go to Shrewsbury Prison in the UK now. It's a closed Her Majesty's prison. You can put on orange jumpsuits. You can spend the day as a prisoner. You can talk to prison officers who are going to kind of tell you the stories of the past. Is that done really in an educational way? Are they telling you the full stories? Or are they telling you the kind of most shocking or sensationalist details? Are they cleansing bits of those stories as well? Are they taking out the state brutality that guards used to do to prisoners? Are they not talking about, the suicides and the mental health problems and the appalling, abhorrent conditions where you get rats and cockroaches and the cells are cold in the winter? Or are they simply, doing it as entertainment? So again, in all of it, the book really is more a provocation than a kind of, this is the answer. As you say, I've backpacked, travelled, had the opportunity to go to sites that I found kind of profoundly moving, upsetting, and really kind of useful in terms of that educational sort of formulation of a recognition of the harms that we can fall into. Srebrenica and Sarajevo, where you can walk over the roses on the street, which are where mortar shells landed and killed people. I think it's really important that you go there, and I totally agree with your kind of experiential. You have to be there to really understand it, for me as well. But I think it's important that we don't then just suspend that when we go into other places, as it were.
Yeah. I mean, breaking it down into, if you're looking at just the two sides of the coin, you have the presentation, I guess, on the destination of the physical place. Or, I mean, maybe it's not always a physical place and like a Jack the Ripper tour, they're going to multiple locations, let's say. I should say, then you have the visitor side, right? And what is the intention of the visitor, and what is the lens through which the visitor is taking in that destination? What is their motivation, their intention behind the visit, and all of that? And well, then there's the consumerism side of some of these places, right? Which is maybe some of these are nonprofits and the money goes in one place, and in other cases, perhaps they're privately owned. And how does that sort of influence the experience and cause people to present it? So I guess, did you go to all the destinations in the book, or?
I haven't been to all of them because the book's written by a number. We've got a number of different people to write them, but the people. So I haven't, and indeed, there's a number of places on there that are on my kind of. Now we're unlocked down, and I can travel the world again. There are places that are on my must travel to list. I am relatively fortunate in that I've been to an awful lot of the places that are listed in the book, and indeed I've been to places that aren't in the book as well, that I think really potentially could have been sites where those sorts of discussions could be framed up, and where again, we could think about the kind of the practices. One of the places that didn't appear in the book, for example, that I've been to, and I think it's fascinating to think of in this way, is I've been to Cape Verde, which is a kind of island, used to be Portuguese controlled, off the coast of Africa, that was very much used as a kind of transportation route in the slave trade, one of the first kind of main stopping ports in the slave trade. And Cape Verde is fascinating because you kind of fly into the very kind of underdeveloped airport in some ways, and then you're taken to luxury 5-star hotels that exist in essentially 2 resorts that exist on the island, and these are all kind of luxury, all-inclusive 5-star hotels. So you don't really interact with the civilian population at all, and indeed there's pretty much nothing on the island for the civilian population other than working in the 5-star hotels. But if you were to kind of move out and look at what is there for the people, they're kind of living in tin-roofed shacks in what is essentially very often kind of grinding poverty, a number of them. This again, there's very little investment in telling the story of the site as a route of development for the slave trade, for example. Instead, it's simply kind of Westerners come here and enjoy the beaches and the opulent luxury, which again, it's those sorts of things, I think, sometimes that kind of challenge our notion that, and our thinking about where the harms are done, because while you're on holiday, sunning yourself in this, in this paradise, you're not necessarily thinking about the fact that all of what is being built or being developed is being on the island is being built and developed largely for rich, privileged kind of Western consumers, and not for the people there. Does that make that a dark site? Well, it doesn't make it a dark site in the way that kind of traditionally we consider the kind of the London Jack the Ripper tours, but perhaps there is a darkness to it. Perhaps we should think about that. And I guess that's what we're kind of trying to say, but not trying to say it in a way that's kind of moralising or don't go there, people. But also, could lead to us asking questions about how ethically we can develop a sort of form of tourism that would allow people to tell the past and also to develop things in perhaps a different way as well, bringing on board the population that live there and letting them see perhaps more of the benefits of having rich Westerners arrive there, which I have to say, I'm guilty of not thinking about those things while I was sunning myself on the beach or, going in the pool, So again, I think, like I say, the book was more a provocation in some ways than it is. It doesn't want to be kind of, it doesn't want to be a kind of moralizing, you must do this and you must think about this. It wants to kind of provocatively prod at us to think about our practices when we go on holiday, and how perhaps some of that might be to erase some of the harms that we do ourselves. Because hey, no one wants to be on holiday thinking about the dark side, do they?
I would like to hear your specific advice for let's call it a not a destination as in a city like you just described, where you're going to a place and there's a lot of societal and local community issues maybe that people are grappling with in that local community with tourism, where tourism meets sort of poverty and that. But let's talk about, let's say that we'll use a hypothetical, plantation or some site where terrible things happened, and you have a history to draw from. You have stories that you have access to. It's not the Matrix. You can't just like plug it into somebody's brain and they can just download everything and experience it. You have to construct a narrative, right? You have to curate the stories and present them in a certain way and do it in a way, and that creates the experience, and therefore that is going to be, let's call it the experience. Like if there's a right way to do that, and I think there is, I mean, of course, there are many nuances to that process, and every site has had to go through that process. They have to figure out what plaques to put up and what stories to tell and how to sort of frame things and tell the stories in the right way. How do people do that? How do destinations do that? And does that get them off the dark destinations list, in your opinion? Like, and you've mentioned this several times, it's meant to sort of create conversation, and it's academic in the sense that there are arguments constructed around each of these sites and sort of conclusions that are come to and everything like that. In the end, ultimately, it sounds like what I'm hearing, at least, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's meant to spark discussion on what constitutes, let's say, a dark destination, some of the things that should be considered and maybe notated and observed. But if it's a problem that needs to be corrected, how do you do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Really great question. I think, we're not for 1 minute suggesting people shouldn't do tourism or that people shouldn't kind of remember historical aspects of the past. I think you were rightly pointing it out. Similarly, you can't necessarily you can't foresee how people will how all people will engage with sites, but I think you can perhaps be you can be more considered in some about how they may, and you can have an expectation around most people. There will always be some that could perhaps turn up and don't act in the way that you want them to. I think when it comes to those kind of traditional dark sites, as you were saying, there is a real value, and it is about the kind of educational aspect of what the purpose is, and it's about kind of trying to remember the harms historically done very often in dark sites. Particularly the traditional places of either murder or genocide, crimes against humanity, and so on. That's very much the kind of standard that's driving them, and I think that's absolutely right. Of course, the problem, I think there is more of a problem with the kind of more sensationalist kind of pushing of a kind of agenda of consume this because of darkness, and indeed some of the kind of promotion of dark destinations, as I was saying earlier, even gets into that sort of standard of come here because it was awful. Now, if you get people in, perhaps you can kind of humanize, and you can change that view a little bit, because the kind of historical act of kind of remembering is far more than for me, it should be far more than just a kind of celebration and so on. I think what's at the centre of it as well, though, and I think this is really kind of important, is the purpose of that education and what it's for, and is it useful and progressive? And I think in his chapter on Whitney Plantation, Tom Raymond gets towards some of that, because obviously that's a site that's kind of a classic site, thinking about the kind of historical legacy of transatlantic slavery and the evils and the harms that were done as part of it. And we should remember, and we should very much tell those emotional, impacting, affecting human stories to educate as part of that. But I think that the thing is, it's not only part of that, but it's also that value of also reminding us that this isn't mission accomplished. If you think about what's going on in the world today, Uyghur people in China are still kind of being forced into camps and forms of slavery. The phones that we take our mobile selfies on while we're at sites, may well contain the materials, the metals that have been mined by children in exploitative conditions in Africa or in the Congo. Now, if we understand those things, I think as privileged consumers in the West, we can not only remember the importance of that history, but we can apply a social pressure as well to do better. It might not be that we can find a perfect form of non-exploitative tourism. There might always be an aspect of exploitation, but we can at least kind of try and make for a better, more ethical, more considered tourism. And I think that's where we would come from. We might not be able to kind of make for the perfect world, and there might always be an attraction of people into the kind of darkness and the darker places. But some of those places that are presented as unproblematic, where there are no problems at all, have very deep problems that might not be shown to you, and you need to ask some questions. And some of those places that are set up as kind of historical legacy sites where it's about kind of learning lessons of the past, the importance is also to remember that those lessons of the past have never been fully learned and continue to have an impact in the world today. Interestingly, and I think it's a great point to consider. I've got a good friend who's been in parts of the Middle East, which at the moment you wouldn't be safe to travel to, and he said to me, look, the thing that gets me is I bet you in 10 or 15 years' time, these will be places, that people come to. They're places where I've gone and seen death and dying, and these will be places that people come to because it's sunny and tropical, and they'll be kind of thriving places, and all of that will be forgotten. And I guess what we're trying to just say is, don't necessarily forget that, because the kind of imperative to see the harms as continuing might drive us to be better consumers and tourists. If we do see the world as kind of more complex and less black and white and less kind of issue solved and done, perhaps we might be able to kind of engender a better, more ethical travel and tourism generally.
The best question a historical site could ask, right, is what serves the victims in the best way possible. And, even if you present the stories with the answer to that question and what you believe is the most perfect way, you still can't control the way a visitor will filter information, or, they bring in their existing perspectives and sort of values and ideas and things like that. Of course, so you can only do so much. But it's a fascinating question. And I think, it's not that, I've been to some of these dark sites, and I've been to Disney World. I've been to, I think about like Alcatraz. When I was at Alcatraz, it was a long time ago, but sure, being there and you kind of soak up what must have been like to be a prisoner here, and you're reading about, Al Capone and all the people that have been there, and how do you escape from here and all this stuff. And it's very easy to kind of be there and it's a beautiful setting, when you look outside at the views and everything, and you imagine, what it must have been like to look out at the beauty around you and be stuck here. And of course you put yourself there in a way, but also it was just an enjoyable day to go out and just to learn. And does that make me a bad person? I guess my point is, I don't know if necessarily visiting these places and, being thoughtful. I don't necessarily feel like, well, okay, you can be thoughtful and you can take it in and empathize and have the experience, but should you feel shame if you weren't crying in the corner, because you went to Alcatraz and you didn't take on the weight of the hardships of the prisoners that were there over the years. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and this again is where things are contested as well, because like I said, very often there isn't a black and white. There are on some of the traditional dark sites. I'm not going to suggest that the killing fields or Auschwitz aren't very much about black and white, but and the huge harms done. But as I said, we don't want to kind of stand there kind of sanctimoniously lecturing people that you must behave in. But I think your point about the victims is a very, very good one. But the way I'd come back in that is that some places that present themselves as kind of wonderful and undark don't want you to see the victims. So you have to ask who the victims are, and that's where we're trying to come from in some ways. Sometimes there will be victims that go unseen, and these places might not be presenting themselves in any way, shape, or form as dark, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't victims found there. Some may be more obvious, but in terms of that presentation of those traditional dark sites, I do think I would totally agree with you. It's one of the reasons I mentioned Srebrenica. You can't escape the fact that Srebrenica still has the mothers and wives of men who were massacred at the site, sort of staffing it, and that's part of the kind of the real kind of impact of this isn't way back historical knowledge. This is somewhere that people in Europe, quite often people from the UK, fly over on their way to kind of European holiday destinations, and we kind of think of genocide. We're much happier to kind of think of genocide as something that was done historically, through blankets covered in smallpox or by the Nazis. But this is something that's still kind of going on in the world today. And I think that connection, for example, that Srebrenica allows you to see, why that's important in a way that perhaps when things do become older sites of kind of history, they can be kind of distanced from us in that kind of psychological.
I was going to mention the connection because it seems like you have less you think of again, going back to the Jack the Ripper thing, like everybody knows that name. Why should that should not be, right? Like, there's probably not one person listening that could name a Jack the Ripper victim without Googling it, because you have less connection with the victims over time and more with the known name of the killer, which is pretty sad.
Absolutely, and indeed, some of the kind of it's an interesting one too when we think about even the more recent examples, where, for example, we've seen in Britain the house site that Fred and Rose West lived in Gloucester, 25 Cromwell Street, was kind of knocked down, so it didn't become a shrine for kind of visitors to flock to. But again, those names, the names of Fred and Rose West as serial killers, or Dharma, become much more kind of apparent than the victims, and very often in some of the really kind of obvious.
But did we really need a fictional series on Dahmer? Come on. Like, is that something that people need to be spending money on and consuming? That pissed me off.
Well, and again, that's where I think kind of Gray's theory kind of comes in a way. Why are we consuming some of these more kind of sensational crimes, in the way that we are? Well, I think you're right. Again, there's very little actual appreciation of the victims there. If people are kind of selling dark sites as, come on in because we're going to shock, scare, and terrify you with this brutal tale, then we're also forgetting that brutal tale had victims left, mothers, fathers, children, facing all sorts of relatives, friends, facing all sorts of harms done by the evils of someone that's now being kind of set up and celebrated. And I understand why people kind of react to that in the bad way and split it off and project it as, it's very much kind of them and us. So when you were originally sort of saying, well, we should have dark tourism to kind of understand those who do that. I get it. Similarly, and it's a great one. I upset my dad totally because one of the things that's in the book is, and again, I didn't write it, is ski destinations. And he'd just come back from a skiing holiday. And we've got a celebrity in the UK, Jeremy Clarkson. Your listeners may be familiar with him through the Amazon Prime Clarkson's Farm, if they can get that. But he's quite a divisive character anyway. And he wrote a newspaper article saying, if you want to protect and save the environment, cancel your next skiing holiday. And I sent that to my dad over WhatsApp, sort of saying, you skier, it's in the book as well, you're destroying the environment for my children, as a joke. It was an entire joke. But he actually did kind of, I think this is where you can't read social media sometimes with people's intent. And he did kind of come back going, Jeremy Clarkson lecturing me with all his cars and cows making methane. I'm not taking lectures from him. But of course, the thing is as well, it is also that thing of, my dad would be someone who's very much kind of like, I want to do something about the environment. He's a kind of older, artsy kind of, progressive, but he wouldn't necessarily see his skiing holidays as contributing to the kind of the harms that he's also trying to undo. And sometimes we do kind of react when we're kind of touched with that. Well, but we are pulled in as well. And I suppose when you were asking me about being a criminologist, we can think about those kind of attractions to the dark side that other people have. It's what those people over there do. But there's always been something in me as well that, I want to kind of, but what is going on? What is making that person tick? Why did he do that?
Well, that's part of the fascination, right? It's everybody has sort of like their shadow self, maybe, or yeah.
Absolutely. And it's very, very human. And similarly, I think it's very human to want to understand the kind of extremes, the harms, the crimes, when we can kind of all go, well, look at those terrible people who slow down and look at accidents and on the highway or the motorway. But we do it too, we often do it too.
In some ways, maybe some of these places are a way to reflect on some of that, and the fascination is less a fascination of it's not like admiration, it's more like trying to understand the human condition. And you could say, okay, well, what if somebody came in and did X, Y, or Z to your kids? You think you would never do X, Y, or Z crime, but you just don't know, because we're all human. That's a weird, dark thing to think about. But I mean, that would be, I use that example with my kids because that would be the thing that would, like, I wouldn't say that would make me snap, but it's like the thing that could have the potential to make somebody snap, right? Like somebody trying to kidnap your kids or something, like, it's just like terrible, terrible thought.
As a destination, one of the places that, and like I say, not everywhere it made it to the book, but one of the places that I've travelled to, and I do mention sort of Sarajevo, and it's one of the most beautiful cities. If your listeners ever get the opportunity to go there, I'm going to give them a boost. But what I remember about being there a good few years ago now is that you've got the legacy of the war, and you can go and see. I'm staying in the same hotel that you see on footage in the Museum of Crimes Against Humanity, burning and being bombed out. But actually, one of the things that really brought it home to me is I went into a bar and I was chatting to the barman, who's a lovely guy, who said, so what have you been up to today? And I sort of said, I've been to the Museum of Crimes Against Humanity and so on. And he said, about the war, I remember it well. It was the kind of maddest time. And this guy about my age, he says, one day I wake up and people are, my friends, and the next day we're trying to kill each other. And
that's, think about things that go on in the world where war comes to somebody's doorstep, what wasn't expected, and they're being invaded, and 1 minute you're living your life and the next minute you're in the trenches. I mean, it's a crazy
absolutely
thing.
And we'll and in a few years' time, Odessa used to be the port city destination people would fly to. They'd go in Kiev, and will we be seeing the same things there as well, or forgetting them? Because like I say again, we can kind of think of these things as done and closed and past, but very often they do sort of strangely come back. Can
I ask you, are you for or against the death penalty?
I'm not like most criminologists, and I personally I'm against, but for one reason more than any other, and that's just the kind of finality of the irreversibility of it. I can see that the arguments around it are often not quite so black and white again as some people necessarily think. And I'm not talking about the vengeance. The other thing I don't like about the death penalty, given that I used to work in and came from a background of working in prisons and so on, is that I think it would make the job particularly in the United Kingdom, where we don't have the death penalty, of police and prison officers sort of far harder. But at the same time, there are times where I kind of I look at people whose reaction to kind of what they regard as the populism of our former Home Secretary Priti Patel in supporting the death penalty as being something absolutely awful and out there. One of the things I do think is, if you were to ask the British public tomorrow if in a referendum on whether they'd reintroduce the death penalty, is that the majority probably would vote for. And I think to kind of to make it a sort of simple, well, there's a right or wrong about it is really complex. There are times where I think I can well understand the rationale and the reasons that people would want to execute some individuals. Not all, but certainly some. You mentioned Dharma earlier on. Ultimately he was murdered in prison. Spoiler, but at the same time, there's not much that can redeem a character like him. Similarly, I remember reading an article by a criminologist that kind of lamented the execution of Saddam Hussein, and he's not a man I can feel very sorry for with what he did to the Kurdish population. I'm not going to suggest I cried any tears when the Iraqi government executed him. So it's a complex one, I think. But for the reason of the finality and an error and protection of criminal justice staff, I come out against.
What is the best way that we as a society can minimize crime and violence?
Oh, it's a huge question, and it's a great one. But I think all the evidence generally sort of stacks up that there are a range of things that you can do, but kind of investment in creating a sort of fair, reasonable, and equitable society that kind of inspires hope in people is probably the best things that you can do. Educate children well, give them chances for meaningful and engaging employment in the future, make them feel valued, give them access to decent and good healthcare, give their children the prospect of a brighter future. And I think most people are generally conformist, and we as human beings are kind of sociable animals that have to coexist and live together, Unfortunately, at times it seems that we kind of go in all the other way, and we kind of allow a tiny percentage of incredibly wealthy individuals now a power and an influence that surpasses all others, perhaps. But I think for the most part, I tend to keep this optimism that humans are generally good, and if you kind of create a good cohesive society for them, they'll generally come together and won't maim and kill each other.
The book is 50 Dark Destinations, Crime and Contemporary Tourism. I don't know, do you have any links you want to share or anything here?
No, but I'd love people to buy the book. I mean, it's got a great cover for one, so even if it is a bit too academic for you, but persist with it. It'll look great on your coffee table. And it is written, like I say, it is written both as kind of academic text, but also one that was hoping to kind of inspire people to think a little bit. And the 50 destinations in it are all worth traveling to and visiting. So if you're interested in travel and tourism and getting back into the world again, now we can after COVID. Because look, being locked down in our houses, it was awful, and not being able to fly and so on. So we were not saying that people don't travel. You can use the 50 as a guide for some places well worth going and seeing and looking at. Plan your tours and your travels, but do so thinking about what's going on here. Or just make it sit on your coffee table and look great because it's got a great cover. But yeah, that's my plug done.
Yeah, I don't know how to end this because there was so much darkness in this conversation. Can we end on like your favorite light destination? Perhaps? Is there one in the world? Please tell me there is, Professor James.
Is there places that I go to? I'll give you
Goodness
three,
God, I feel like I'm crawling out of the hole of darkness right now.
Absolutely. Let's crawl out of the hole of darkness. Number one, come to the Midlands in the United Kingdom, and come to Birmingham as the best city. It's wonderfully diverse. You can have a Balti here. There's so much going on in Birmingham that people often go past to go and look at Shakespeare's house in Stratford or Warwick Castle and ye olde England. But if you travel to England, don't just do London. Come and look at the wonders that you have in the Midlands as well, because it's very different. It's beautiful and it's utterly fantastic. So do a few days, maybe a week around kind of Birmingham, Staffordshire, and the wider, because I love being there. But for the two travel destinations that I'd give, I think first off, North Africa, Tunisia. Has been the site of terrorist attacks and shootings, Port Al-Kantawi and not so much Sousse, but North Africa, Tunisia or Morocco, Marrakesh, great places to visit. But the other one for me, I suppose, Sarajevo. Go to Sarajevo, East meets West. Absolutely fantastic place, friendly, lovely people. Still a bit of darkness there in the background, but if you go to Sarajevo, also go out and explore. Explore the world, get out in the world. I'm so lucky. I've managed to go traveling all over Europe. I've been to Australia and New Zealand. I've been in the United States. I've managed to travel to Africa. Travel and go into places is one of the privileges that I think we really ought to re-embrace after lockdown. Meet people, be sociable again, because those things are great. You know, they are. I'm not saying to people, don't travel, don't do tourism. It's just when you do it, ask questions.
Ask questions. Cool. So we'll finish on that. Thank you so much for your time and appreciate it.
No problem. No worries at all, Jason. Hope it's useful and good.
Take care.
Take care. Thank you very much.
There you have it. Thank you once again to Professor James Treadwell. Very interesting topic. Dark tourism, something I hadn't covered on the show before. And if you want me to do some other topics that you haven't heard about, either at all or for a while, you can get in touch. Jason@zerototravel.com is my email. And of course, you can sign up for the newsletter over at zerototravel.com/newsletter, which is free. And I got to say, along the lines of dark destinations, dark tourism, I love a good ghost tour. Have you done a good ghost tour? Always cool to walk around. I remember doing one in Rhode Island once, and it was a cool fall night and the wind was blowing, talking about ghosts standing outside of old buildings. It was fun. There you go. Maybe that's dark destinations light. I don't know. Speaking of light, let's get into the light. We've been crawling out of the darkness. We're going to finish with a quote here. This one, appropriate for today's show, from Eleanor Roosevelt. It is better to light one small candle than to curse the darkness. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Peace and love to you and yours. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by zerototravel.com.